Hi, this is Paul. Rod Dreher and Elizabeth Oldfield sat down for a conversation on the sacred. Rod's book is Rod's book out or coming out? Rod's book is now out. Living in Wonder, Finding Mystery and Meaning in a Secular Age. #1 in Angelology and Demonology. Wow. Amazon, of course, always gives books, tries to get them to be #1 in something. I don't quite know how many categories. I don't quite know how many categories it has, but so these two sat down for a chat, and it was a really good one, and it went very well. And I was so interested when Algo served up this video. I thought, oh, this will be interesting, because on many levels, these two really do track, but on especially the persona of Rod in the blog, these two will really clash. And she got into it a little bit, and she reflects it a little bit. She does the interview, and afterwards she does a little reflection on it. And I just respect the heck out of both of these people. But let's go.
About wonder then, and I really liked the line in your acknowledgement where you said Ross Douthat had said to you, you need to write your woo book. It's a fascinating exploration of some things that a lot of, I think, mainstream readers are going to be like, wow, we're really in it now. What felt...
And some mainstream readers are going to be like, oh, why can't we divorce this hooey from reality? I do want to mention, because I've been doing some Nathan Jacobs podcasts and going through his catalog, he's gotten well underway. The Myth of the Enlightenment is a really good conversation between himself and Chris Firestone, who I didn't know at all. But there's a lot of really interesting stuff and some good stuff, some Nick Waltersdorf stories, a lot of fun stories about Nathan. But it gets into, and of course, Rod and Cale, their conversation just came out this afternoon. But let's get back into this.
So important for you to write about what does it mean to live in an enchanted world and to posture ourselves towards ways that maybe humans did for centuries and we've possibly forgotten how to do.
Well, you know, I've been telling woo stories about exorcism, about miracles, things that I've encountered or people I've come to know have encountered for years. And you can really, get a room in the palm of your hand when you tell these stories. And I was wondering, what's the point of them? Why should they matter to people? And I think they should matter to people because they reveal a hidden order. They reveal that there is transcendence, that the world is not what we think it is. I've lived that way for almost my entire Christian life because I happen to be a weirdo magnet. I attract people who have these stories, but also they've happened to me. I mean, I'll give you a mild example. When I was in Rome for Pope,
and you can catch the example, but when he said what he just said there, it really grabbed me.
Telling woo stories about exorcism, about years, and you can really. And I was wondering, what's the point of them? Why should they matter to people? And I think they should matter to people because they reveal a hidden order. They reveal that there is transcendence, that the world is not what we think it is. I've lived that way for.
And I thought he said it nicely there, and I found his framing of it right there very helpful. So Clara, I don't know which way she goes with it. She's doing live streaming. So some of you know that I created a TLC Starters Kit page on my blog. I might take this a little further. I've been toying with this idea for a little while, to have a little bit more presence and a little bit more structure on some of this to help people find things. I had a conversation with a Christian Reformed minister who has sort of been starting an online church, and he's been playing with that idea, and it's actually his job, and so he's been producing things. And a friend then, actually someone who was his boss, I don't know if he still is his boss, who was a friend and colleague of mine, said, you should talk to Paul Vanderklay. And so we had an offline conversation, and he was asking me questions. I said, well, basically, get into ElseNet, do a couple estuary things so you can get a sense of estuary, and get involved in the TLC, and you will learn a lot. And, well, how do you get involved in the TLC? And so I was going to type him out this email where I'd have links and everything. And it's like, ugh, type that all into an email that only goes to one person, when in fact this thing rises in my mind on a fairly regular basis. Why don't I just put it in a blog and go with it from there? So that's what I did. And so I'll leave the link to this below. But I got into some of these issues with Clara. And sometimes, and this is part of the weirdness of the internet, that I've noted before that when I turn on the camera, Freddie talks to his mom through the camera when we're doing the Freddie and Paul show. The internet has a quality of transcendent about it that people intuitively know, which is why people will be transparent about themselves, which is why the internet and Twitter is such a rough place, because it's that transcendent quality that people are intuitively acting upon when they say the most awful things on the internet, because it's, in a sense, a weird public confessional. So in that sense, people do bring disclosures in Randos conversations because of that element. But there's obviously a degree to which it is unsafe and sometimes unwise. Whereas if you can establish a community of trust, it can be far more healing, because now they can disclose the kinds of things that, for very good reasons, they shouldn't disclose on the internet. So I don't know if I'll maybe clip a bunch of this and put it to the end. The whole thing was a great conversation, and Clara is just such a wonderful addition to the TLC. And she's really sort of dived in. She's got her own channel now. She's playing around with it. She's hosting live streams. She's doing all of those things. And so, and of course she worked on a PhD in sociology, and she has found us interesting enough to study. But this relationship between the transcendence on the internet and what Dreer and Oldfield are talking about in terms of a return of wonder. So I had a conversation with Upcycle today too, and we got into that as well, that the internet in a sense bottoms out, and people are, I have a little clip. Maybe I've released the whole thing to the No Wait No Ads membership section. I've released a couple clips to the Randos membership section, and it'll all be coming out soon. But when I do this, I want to make it and I want to share it, and the members are just kind of an easy place that I can share it right away without sort of disrupting the entire channel and the flow of the whole channel, which I sort of watch as I release things. Part of what happened in the Peterson, this question of, and I know for many of you, you want to camp on this word supernatural. It's not the right word. You cannot use that word supernatural without bringing in the modern framing. And the modern framing is doing some distorting that won't actually let the miracles of Jesus have their proper place within the ecology of all of what the modern period calls supernatural. part of why this conversation goes the way it goes is it gets into the question of opportunity and possibility. And the Enlightenment lid on the iron box of secularism says this class of thing does not happen unless we can establish material, efficient cause and effect in theory, because of course they have to concede there's way too much to actually account for. So they have to do it sort of in theory. They have to sort of set up a tiny little micro mythology. And in fact, the entire rule is blatantly mythological. Unless you can establish a material cause and effect, such and such a thing did not happen. Or you need some extraordinary evidence. But evidence, when you put something like extraordinary in front of evidence, again, you're really leaning into a mythological vision of it. The supernatural exclusion, and again, I don't like the word, but I'm going to use it because it's probably will communicate best. The supernatural exclusion by the Enlightenment, which, again, if you go back and you listen to Nathan Jacobs and Chris Firestone talk about this, there's been a retelling of the story to prejudice it, and that's part of what Nathan Jacobs and Chris Firestone talk about. But as John Vervaeke notes here, the entire effort basically is cast in a mythological light, even in service of imagined rationality. And the imagined rationality is itself a form of mythology.
But what I can talk about is, well, an important cognitive process in identity formation is what Agnes Callard calls aspiration. This is like I want to be other than I am. I want to be a person other than I am. That's a fundamental identity change, and it's based on L.A. Paul's work on transformative experiences. We're going to talk about both of these women's important work in this book. And so, what do you have to do to go through aspiration, to go through transformative experiences? Well, you can't reason your way through it. If what you mean by reason is making inferences, using decision theory, you have to use imaginal, serious play. You have to internalize the sage. You have to internalize the role model. You have to do dialogical practices, right? And this, I can back this up with, both good theory and good empirical evidence, right? Even some recently done by, well, he was my RA. He's now got his PhD. He's now Dr. Jin-Sung Kim. I'll talk a bit about his work. About people doing aspirational projects in the university. Now, here's the important point that I'm going to use Callard to make. The desire, so a proper part of being rational is the imperative to be more rational, right? So rationality is an inherently aspirational entity, which means at the heart of rationality is aspiration and transformative experience, which requires ritual, because ritual is imaginal, serious play. And this goes to...
That's really... Yeah. It's just funny because just with that, you completely undermine the entire project of rationalism, because that's true. I'd never thought about it, that because you want to be reasonable.
Yes.
Reason becomes aspirational, and therefore you have to kind of imagine and project yourself into that space before you enter into it, because why would you desire it if you couldn't imagine yourself in a future state where you have to move towards that future state through imagination?
And by the way, notice you're gesturing, you're right, and you're using perspectival and participatory knowing.
Yeah.
Right? What's it like to be that person, and who will I be? What will the agent arena relationship be like when I am that person? And this goes to very formal arguments from people at the core of like computational psychology. Like you can't, like, I won't get into the details, but if I'm in a weaker logic, like predicate calculus, and I'm trying to get to a stronger logic, modal logic. And what stronger means? I can grasp more of reality with the logic. I can represent more. There's nothing I can do, and I can run all.
In other words, if you think about this project of banishing enchantment, the goal of banishing enchantment was, of course, certainty and distilling the world down into the kinds of cause and effect processes and relationships that will achieve the outcomes we desire. But right again, you are both imagining this entire world, which is fundamentally a mythological move, and the whole thing is in purpose of that which you desire. Now, what do you desire? And again, you can fall back to Chesterton. Even if you listen to Michael Shermer in the video that I played yesterday a little bit, okay, having enough food rather than starving, having being warm instead of being suffering from hypothermia. You set up all of these little A-B tests, but that sort of falls apart because, again, you cannot have enough tests to actually account for what will finally be satisfying. Again, in my conversation that I had with Upcycle, I mentioned sort of my definition of God as being that which satisfies eternally, perfectly, and completely. And of course, people will say, no such thing exists in the world. It sort of functions as kind of a crypto-ontological argument. And it sort of functions as C.S. Lewis's argument from desire, because the question is then, will there ever be satisfaction? Can there ever be satisfaction? Why are our hearts this way? Now you might say, well, our hearts are this way because there is dissatisfaction and we're never happy with dissatisfaction. And so, okay. But the point of this is that all of this mythological, imaginary stuff is employed in this. Now, obviously, the questions of wonder, questions of desire get pulled into questions of enchantment. We are looking for magic. We are looking for escape. We are looking for resolution. We are looking for every Sunday morning I do prayer requests at Living Stones, and people are looking for solutions. Solutions to cancer, solutions to relational difficulties, solutions to money difficulties, solutions to emotional difficulties. And while they are, generally speaking, all pursuing at least some degree of direct causal resolution to these things, they are going to the doctor, they are in the hospital, they are doing all of these things, there remains a desire for a different world. And that desire does not go away. Now, again, obviously, the fact of the desire does not necessitate the reality of its satisfaction. I completely understand that. But it is, in fact, a tell. It is, in fact, something that suggests maybe, but maybe, as Lewis says with his argument from desire, most of our desires have within the world at least a mediating satisfaction or a temporary satisfaction or a whiff of something that satisfies, and they can sort of get us there. And so, well, why again all the drama about the supernatural? Well, we don't want people to do foolish things, and people do foolish things all the time with respect to the supernatural. The world is abundant with respect to that. Yet, the world is abundant also with respect to causal relationships and people's desire. Is it supernatural that someone would win the lottery? Just think about that. You'd say, no, it's not supernatural. Someone wins the lottery all the time. Do you recommend playing the lottery as a way out of, let's say, your debt problems? Well, no. Well, why? Well, statistics. Okay. So what are you really saying? it's not easy to sort of get your mind around how this works for human beings. Now, I actually think Peterson really starts this section strongly, and Alex O'Connor derails it.
Truth, as we know, is a tricky business. Do you think there are differences in the truth claims between different writers of fiction? Like, is Dostoevsky more profound than...
No, well, I wouldn't call fiction truth claims anyway. I mean, these are...
Then on what grounds do we rank order the fiction in terms of quality? Like, Dostoevsky is a profound purveyor of fiction on the philosophical...
It's tremendously helpful to remember that in the evolution of the university from the 19th to the 20th century, a big piece of the secularization of the universities was the pass-through from religious studies to humanities, and humanities usually involved... I remember when I was reading a biography of C.S. Lewis and discovering that English degrees were just coming online when Lewis was starting his career in the 20th century. He wanted to get a job in a philosophical department, but instead he got one teaching English, and English was a new discipline. And I thought this was absolutely fascinating, because why would English be a new discipline at Oxford in the first half of the 20th century? What is new about English? And the issue was that what had been happening in the universities subtly was that there was more and more skepticism with respect to theology, and English literature took its place for giving wisdom. Well, what is that wisdom for? Wisdom is for navigating your life. You're living in this world of all of this data, and as Peterson talked about earlier, you have to figure out how to go through a cornfield. Science can't tell you how to navigate through a cornfield. Science might be able to tell you how to get from A to B in terms of, let's say, math or geometry, but when you talk about the best way to move through a cornfield, well, that word best is going to be combinatorial explosive for a whole bunch of reasons. Are there lions in the cornfield? What are you wearing when you're going through the cornfield? What time of year is the cornfield in? And again, you can talk about all of this data as facts, as it were, but the ought, yesterday we talked about morality, all of that won't help you. And so this point that he's making to Dawkins, which Dawkins won't answer basically because Alex O'Connor sort of interrupts and says, no, I want to go back, is an incredibly important point that Dawkins basically can't answer. There were all sorts of attempts to get at how can we scientifically evaluate works of fiction. And it's important to also remember that postmodernity, as it arose, basically arose out of literary criticism. Well, why is that important? Well, because in literary criticism, the inability of the limited frame of science to actually say anything was exposed.
Front, unbelievably deep and profound.
Yes,
There's something true about what he's in terms of quality. Like, Dostoevsky is a profound purveyor of fiction on the philosophical front, unbelievably deep and profound.
Yes,
There's something true about what he's writing about.
It's nothing to do with the truth that science is concerned with.
Okay, so, are you talking separate magisterium? So in other words, well, which is more like your life? Which is more like what you should care about? When you look at how people live, when you look at the meaning crisis, when you look at the kinds of things people get depressed over, when you look at the kinds of things that people will run to a pastor or a therapist or a friend or a parent or a colleague, when you look at the kinds of things they are in panic over, they are not the kinds of things that Richard Dawkins is concerned about. They're the kinds of things that novels deal with.
Truth of science is the truth that gets us to the moon. I mean, this is nothing to do with...
And this goes all the way back, okay, gets us to the moon. Why do we want to go to the moon? Science cannot answer that question. Why should we go to the moon? Science can surely not answer that question. Because, again, we're back into this question of values. And, well, where do these values come from? You simply can't navigate without values because, again, it's by virtue of values that we rank order things in our hierarchy. And, in fact, Dawkins' whole point here is, it's astounding that he says this repeatedly in this conversation. I don't value mythology like I value the kind of things that I call facts. Okay. So in other words, it's all simply personal preference? Well, what is the source of personal preference? So Elizabeth and Rod like their woo stories. Why? And what are their woo stories based on?
For almost my entire Christian life, because I happen to be a weirdo magnet. You know, I attract people who have these stories, but also they've happened to me. I mean, I'll give you a mild example. When I was in Rome for Pope Benedict XVI's funeral a couple of years ago, I was in my hotel room getting ready to go down to St. Peter's Square early the morning for the funeral. I heard this crash behind me, and I whirled around, and my desk chair was sitting in a pile of pipes and fabric. It was not a wooden chair. It was not an old chair, but I noticed that a bolt that it was holding it all together had been sheared in two. I thought, good Lord, but I don't have time to think about it. I've got to get down to St. Peter's. The funeral happened, and I was really angered by the homily Pope Francis gave, which I thought was really disrespectful to Pope Benedict, a man I revere. That afternoon, I met some journalists, two American journalists who covered the Vatican at a restaurant in Vatican City, and we were talking about what happened, and both of these men were telling me how difficult as Catholics their jobs were covering the Vatican because, as they agreed, so little about what happens in that place has anything to do with Jesus Christ. Well, then I told them the story about the weird thing that happened in my room that morning. As I told the story, Elizabeth, the unoccupied chair at the table flips over backwards. No one was sitting on it, and everyone just fell silent. Well, I texted a friend of mine who's an exorcist in the Vatican. I said, this is what happened in the hotel room. This is what happened in the restaurant. What do you think's going on? He said, the enemy is just letting you know he's got his eye on you. And that's a small story. I've got some big ones that come out in the book. But it's just a reminder that we live in a world that is filled with mystery and the unseen.
Now, again, I don't expect those stories to do anything for anyone. Those stories are obviously couched within a narrative that you might call mythological, but the fact in a public restaurant of a chair moving by itself, well, that's that. Well, how do you interpret that? Where do you go? A big piece of this, however, as Elizabeth Oldfield point that she makes later on in the conversation, is that, in fact, this is changing in the world.
Just the centrality of encounter. I'm a kind of charismatic Christian. I have kind of started there and then lost my faith and then found my way back to something very austere and rational and intellectual. And now I'm really I find it quite mischievous because I'm often speaking about these things in settings that are not Christian or Christians but scared of this bit, and talking about, I went to church on Sunday and had a really big cry and a dance and needed to speak in tongues because of my sense that the transcendent and the mysterious and the these moments of encounter and breaking through are, I think you use the line, the sort of heart of all true religion, or the center of all true religion. And I think we're moving from a moment where I was saying the other day that with my more sort of sociology of religion hat on, and I spend a lot of time listening to people outside the church, that we're moving from the non-religious default being kind of atheisty, although more like agnostic-y, to the default amongst the non-religious, particularly amongst younger people and particularly amongst women, partly, I think, driven by the climate crisis and by psychedelics, to more default pagan-y. And pagan is not a helpful sociological category, but it's the best I've got at the moment. And what I'm observing in my friends who are not who are non-religious or outside the church, this real, particularly among young women, this uptick in interest in astrology and tarot, and people talk about themselves being witchy. And what your book made me think is that there is something, related or parallel or reacting to willingness in the church to talk more explicitly about what has always been the sort of orthodox cosmology of angels and demons, essentially. What do you think is driving? Why now? Why is this moment of what you see as being a kind of re-enchantment of the world happening?
Yeah, as I write in the book, one of the big turning points in this project was when a young Anglican ordinand, Daniel Kim, approached me in Oxford a couple of years ago and told me just what you said. He said to me, your generation, Rod, I'm in my mid-50s, your generation thinks that the new atheism is a default. That's not the case anymore with my generation. He was 27 at the time. And he said just what you did, that they're turning to the occult. Well, I think what they're doing here is, and also Christians, younger Christians in Generation Z, who are turning to the more numinous focused Christian traditions, is they realize that rationalism is not enough. That it's very dry, and moralism is not enough either.
Well, and again, it is a mythology. It is sort of a aspirational arena. And of course, the very bad news for them is that I know they'd love to cheer on the death of the church, but it's like you never even had your day in the sun, really.
I remember back in, 2014, I think it was, I was talking to a sociologist of religion in the U.S., Christian Smith, who's done the most work about the religious lives of younger people. And he was the one who came up with the term that many people know now, moralistic therapeutic deism. And he said, this is a de facto religion of young people in America, whatever their tradition is.
Well, and while, of course, I've talked about moralistic therapeutic deism for a long time, I read Christian Smith's book before. I think I found Rod Dreher. Maybe I found it through Rod Dreher. That could be too. I don't know. But the deism part is the part that's going away. Elizabeth Oldfield recently had a conversation with, she's a little conflicted in terms of how she'd like to be identified, a witch, a psychic. And the conversation was fascinating. And this was one of the conversations that I thought, I want to talk about this. But there's so many conversations I want to talk about that I didn't really make a video. And so here it is now. And she made some really interesting observations.
Individuals. And ultimately, what happened was I was very good at what I did. And so word of mouth spread, and I started seeing all sorts of people. So people would come in from all over the world to have a session with me. And this is when I was really like 20 years old, 90, I was young. And one of those people, or a collection of those people, actually, it's not really just down to one, would be people that that had businesses, and often would be in very senior positions with very big businesses. And of course and I say of course because I was...
And it strikes me, her story is in some ways analogous to Jordan Hall's story, but Jordan Hall sort of climbs the rationalist business tech bro thing, and she's the new age thing, but they're climbing the same trees.
So naive. I was 20, maybe 21 years old. I wasn't, a child and also a bit of an idiot. And I was charging £25 for an hour of my time. And I would be giving them just, so much value. And they saw that. And so basically what happened is that they sort of plucked me out of that and were like, okay, how can we use this? How can we use this? They didn't care. This is the thing that I think I would like everybody to understand about industrial intuition, is that most of the concern and the anxiety about the epistemological validity of psychic work is really held by the middle classes, right? It really is. It's like those of us who have a sort of enough understanding of, knowledge and philosophy and natural science to kind of have questions, but not enough of an education or an understanding to actually deeply question why we think we know what we think we know. And most of the people that are making the most money in the world, and I say this with absolute confidence because I know them, they're using any form of extra information that they can. They don't care where and how I get the information. They're not even interested in why or how I know these things. They care about the bottom line. And so when I realized this and discovered this, I've never been, not ever been somebody that has been trying to prove my value. Like, not ever, and I never will be. I went through a period of time where I felt very concerned, I suppose, and I still have this. Am I giving enough? That's a different kind of question. But in terms of like, was it valuable? Like that I wasn't trying to ever prove to somebody that psychic, I'm problematizing this word, but intuitive information was valuable because it just evidently was. And so I had these clients that then, wanted to work with me to find out how they could use me as a resource. And so for a period of time, and by the way, I basically don't do this anymore for a collection of political reasons, and also I don't need to. But I would work with large corporations.
She doesn't need to because she's already got FU money from doing what she's done.
I with their board of directors. So I would have one member on the C-suite. So that's the, top level of management. I would need to work with somebody who had directorial control, i.e. they had the capacity to make decisions and choices. And I would sit with them, they would be my handler, and then I would do my work. That is to say, I would close my eyes and access the cloud, bring it down into the knife, and give them data. That's how it really ultimately would be. And then they would use that data and then they would make more money. And so, yes, I did that for over a decade. And I think, I definitely didn't charge enough money. That's one thing I would say, is that I know that I'm responsible for making millions of pounds for people. And, a part of the reason that I don't do this anymore, I mean, occasionally if there is a circumstance or a situation or a client that I feel like is absolutely aligned politically with me, that I feel is really good and excited about, then absolutely I will. But it's very boring work. It's not very satisfying. It doesn't feel meaningful to me. It ultimately is just stoking the fires of, capitalist industry. I did it because I needed to, but I mean, it's so dull. And I'm intelligent and creative, and I didn't want to do that with my life. And I wasn't even being charged, wasn't even being paid sufficiently. I think at the time I was being paid £5,000 a day or something silly like that,
And Elizabeth Oldfield almost falls off her chair. Elizabeth Oldfield, it's like if Elizabeth Oldfield's little podcast makes £5,000 this year, Elizabeth Oldfield is probably pretty happy. It was such boring work. I'm making £5,000 a day. Oh. Part of what was so interesting about her was that you would think that all this New Age stuff, that her basic framing of values would be different, but the conversation was filled with this kind of thing.
My areas of expertise and experience. The fundamental problem with the training of priests in both of those Christian traditions is that it is ultimately still governed and dominated by the structures of oppression that cause all the problems in the world, and that is to say patriarchy, capitalism, and specifically colonialism. And so I have to say, I just don't respect, I just do not hold any respect, zero, for such training. So that's the first thing. And I think that
and so it's like, oh, okay, so you're even though you've got all the New Age stuff, you're still just basically formed by the stuff that's in the university. And you know, what's been really funny about Elizabeth.
And the final thing with Rod is to name something, which is that I found it more emotionally and intellectually turbulent preparing for this podcast than for most, because every guest I talk to, I have some things in common with and some things that are different or that I disagree with or I don't understand. But with Rod, it was like both of those things had been turned up to 11. We both have a huge amount in common. It's very rare that I meet someone who is a sort of interested in and versed in monasticism as me, but he also talks about beauty. He writes about the sacred. He writes about the kind of erotic element of spirituality, as I said, very unusual that anyone else goes there. There's passages in his book that I was like, oh, I've written something really similar to that, or I could have written that. I was sort of nodding along vigorously. Not all of it, by a long way, but sufficiently to it that I felt this really strong, like, oh, there's loads we can talk about that we have in common. And a probable equal amount of dissonance, of disagreement, of radically different intuitions. Not so much in that book, because that book doesn't really go there. In fact, what I'm noticing is none of his books quite go there in the same way that some of his Substack and his public profiles do. But this radically different political theology, essentially, that could lead him to see in Trump and Orban leaders that the world needs.
And so with all of this, it just fascinates me. The political frame still just controls. So some of you might have seen I had a little back and forth with Preston Sprinkle about some of this, and I'm hoping that we have a conversation about this, because it is tremendously hard to sort of tease out, and I by no means imagine I have the answers, because, you know, I have just these few things that I've talked about. Religion is dollars, politics is cents. Religion is always, politics is now. Trying to understand the relationship between, but it just absolutely fascinated me that these spirit of the age type things. Oh, my dog is really trying to get my attention. Maybe she has to go. So if the dog has to go, then I need to stop. So anyway, this was, for me, I almost erased this podcast 3 or 4 different times. Now you're really insistent. You're really insistent, aren't you, baby? Yes. But it lives, and I'm ending it. So hate it, love it, leave a comment. Do something.